out your notebook. There's more. Welcome to CN Live, episode 10. I'm Joe Loria.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
On tonight's show, we will look at the attack on Saudi oil installations and the potential U.S. response with two Middle East experts. The U.S. Secretary of Defense on Friday said the U.S. was sending more troops and air defense systems to defend Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That was nearly a week after a significant attack on Saudi oil installations, knocking out about half of Saudi oil production. As'ad AbuKhalil is standing by in Modesto, California. Thank you for joining us this evening. So we move from one depressing topic to another.
Right.
Climate crisis to situation, what has dramatically taken place since last weekend. Even in a schoolyard fight, you have to sometimes find out who started it. So the war in Yemen, it was the Saudis who started that war. And it's not as if these missiles came out of the blue and struck their oil facilities last Saturday. Now, I want to ask you, As'ad, we're going to talk a little bit in depth about the Yemen war, how it began. I was at the UN there, and Jamal Ben Omar was the UN envoy there, and he told me that he believed the Saudis started this war because they were very close to a deal. The Houthis had agreed to evacuate Sana'a. They had agreed to 30% representation capped in the parliament, and women would have 30%. And the only thing they couldn't agree on, there was going to be a UN force trained to come in and replace them in the capital. Well, the only thing they couldn't agree on was the role of the presidency. Hadi was in Saudi Arabia was insisting on remaining the top guy, and there were some proposals that there would be a rotating presidency like they had in Yugoslavia for a while, or there would be a strong vice president. But the Saudis started bombing, and this war is still going on, and they got hit pretty badly. And we the way it's framed in the corporate media is this is just some kind of crazy terrorist attack, not in the context of a war. So As'ad, thank you for joining us. And and the other main thing we're going to talk about is the U.S. response to this. Right. And my view, and I could be wrong, is the U.S. Iran has calculated that the U.S. really cannot respond militarily, certainly not in a large way, because the consequences to the region, to the United States itself, to the world economy with a U.S. election coming up will be too great. And there are some grown-up people maybe in the Pentagon who have figured this out, and I think the Iranians may have figured that out, and that's why this attack happened, not directly from Iran, but most likely from Houthis, who they don't have complete control over either. Anyway, As'ad, I've said a lot, so let's just pick it up where you'd like to.
Well, I think your intro is quite apt about how the Saudi government did not want a peaceful settlement in Yemen whatsoever. And I think it's fair to say that Yemen has been at war on and off since the 1960s, and largely because of Saudi Arabia and largely because of its same sponsors. I mean, people forget there was a very long bloody war in Yemen in the 1960s, and it had the same characters. There were feuding parties inside Yemen. And of course, the Saudis will always make sure to support the worst. And the United States always picks the most reactionary, most conservative. And they were supporting the royalists. The Republicans were supported by the progressive leadership of Nasser in Egypt at the time. And the Israelis were involved, just like they are now, behind the scenes, but not so covertly. It's all around. And I think the Saudis do not want to have a progressive government in Southern Arabia. People forget the only Marxist government in the Arab world that ever took place was in the 1970s in South Yemen. And that was an exemplary government when it came to rights of women, secularism, progressiveness, social justice, all these things that ostensibly liberals care about, but in reality, when they are served to Arabs by Arabs, they are opposed by liberals in the West. Because they clash with the colonial project and imperial interest, which far more supersede the interests of native colored people over there. So we are seeing a refighting of the war in Yemen. with similar characters. The only absence now is that the Houthis are not progressive, but certainly the most reactionary parties in Yemen would always be the ones that are handpicked by the Saudis, President Hadi, who you mentioned, and he doesn't control any agenda. Basically, he is a client of the Saudis, whatever they want. It is fair to say, Joe, that just as in Israeli elections, especially by Labour Party leaders, the so-called left, whenever there was an election, the Labour Party, if they were in government, they tried to enhance their electoral credential and fortunes by committing a massacre, usually in Lebanon. For much of the 1980s and 1990s, we witnessed Prime Minister Shimon Peres and others, they want to establish how tough they are against the Arabs by massively bombing Lebanon, refugee camps in Lebanon, and so on. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was attempting to do something similar like the Israelis. He was new to the scene. He wanted to announce himself in a big way, in an Israeli way, by showing how tough he was. And the calculation was that he is going to finish this war fairly quickly. And the accomplices of this horrific project were none other than the Obama administration officials. And you were at the UN, and you knew full well how supportive Samantha Power, who has a new book out about her idealism and humanitarianism, how supportive they were of the Saudis, how much they tried to shield them, protect them from any criticism at the United Nations. And the Obama administration gave them full support on the calculation. It's not going to go that far. Only when it got so out of hand, and then you have very mild criticism at the very end of the Obama administration. And what we are witnessing now is that a failure of the colonial project in Yemen in order to subdue the rebellions of the Houthis. And what people do not report is that the Houthis, they were not widely popular when they started. But what happened is, and I know from Yemenis here in America who have nothing to do with the Houthis and who do not support Iran, but the devastation and the brutality of American, Saudi, UAE bombings of Yemen is so indiscriminate that people became so hostile to the other forces. And that gave support for the Houthis inside Yemen, surprisingly. And the Saudis, now they are pressured by the Americans, from what we read, that they have to conclude this war. And the Iranians are basically increasing their support for the Houthis because they know now it is a regional conflict. It is not a small conflict. It never was a small conflict. Yemeni conflict started largely as an attempt by Saudi Arabia to impose its will throughout Arabia and to enhance the credentials of this new, young, tough leader who is modeling himself after Netanyahu. Well, that didn't go well at all. It went so bad that the Saudis and the Emiratis inside Yemen are clashing and fighting against each other. And some of them even made allies with Al-Qaeda, the forces that the United States was fighting inside Yemen. And people do not realize that the horrific, corrupt regime of Yemen was set up by a combination of forces, including the US and Saudi Arabia. And as long as that guy was doing the bidding, he was supported by Democrats and Republicans here in America, as always. Only when the people of Yemen made it very clear they are not going to accept his leadership, there was an attempt to arrange for a fictitious transition. This was no transition. They replaced the tyrant with his hand-picked successor, a man who is totally corrupt, has no credential or popularity inside Yemen. This is very much like Hillary Clinton's solution to the turmoil in Egypt in 2011. When the people of Egypt revolted, people forget, initially, the Obama administration stood by them fairly soon. Only when they realized the Egyptian people will under no circumstances, would accept the leadership of Mubarak, and despite pressure by Netanyahu and the Saudi king, Obama basically realized it's not going to continue. So then Hillary came up with her ingenious plan. If you remember correctly, she wanted to replace the tyrant with his hand-picked head of the secret police, Omar Suleiman. And then, of course, they realized that people are not going to go for that. And of course, then there was an election, the wrong man won. And whenever the wrong man wins in third world countries, the United States is always ready around the corner to prepare an alternative. And that's when the dictatorship, the military dictatorship took place inside Egypt. As far as the calculation of the Iranians, Joe, I am not sure that the Iranians have calculated that the United States is not going to war. I think they read American politics well enough to know that there is an array of forces now at play, putting so much pressure on Trump in order to go to war. I mean, look at the consensus. We have never seen, I mean, people in Washington, the media, the think tank people, and the human rights shops are all in agreement against Trump. They criticize Trump and they mock Trump and so on. But the only time we remember in the Trump administration when they were very pleased with his performance was when he ordered the bombing of Syria. Everybody then thought how presidential he was. We are witnessing a similar cycle. If you look at the Twitter account of the Obama officials, you will find all of them, as well as Republican pundits, and Senator Lindsey Graham is a good spokesperson of this crowd. They want war. They want to go to war. And former Secretary of Defense in his book, Robert Gates, said that the Saudis want America to go to war against Iran to the last American. Of course, he was not courageous enough to add to the last American also on behalf of Israel. Israel has been, I mean, the lobby of war includes Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, of course, notably, the Washington scene, the establishment of Washington. They all want to go to war. And it has to be said that Trump is the most resistant to this war agenda in the Middle East right now. I mean, I would be certain that if it was Obama or Bush, they would have gone to war already. I mean, this is not so much a defense of Trump, but it is as the fact that the Republicans and Democrats are far more warmongering than Trump. The Iranians, I think, are calculating that there is a possibility of war. And what they are trying to prove is this. When they attacked, I mean, if they attacked shipping in the Gulf, when they took over that British barge and so on, and now with the attacks, if they were behind it, even though the claim was made by the Houthis, if they were behind the attack on the oil installation, which is responsible for 5.7 million of barrels of oil a day, which is more than 50% of oil production of Saudi Arabia, which is drastically influencing to the oil market. I mean, there was a 10% increase the first day of that bombing. What they are doing is to say, if there is going to be war, and even if there is not going to be war, because Iran, from its own standpoint, forget about the government, the people of Iran feel they are now being victims of a war that is declared by the United States, and they are suffering in their economic livelihood. And we have a saying in Arabic, I mean, to cut somebody's sources of livelihood is like cutting somebody's throat. And the Iranians feel they are victims of a war, and they want to prove to the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates that we will take the war to you. And these are very fragile, vulnerable governments. And Trump himself in his campaign said famously and accurately that those regimes would not have survived throughout the decades if it wasn't for US direct protection, military protection. And we saw that the Iranian policy of trying to take this conflict to these governments have worked. Suddenly, United Arab Emirates announced that they are unilaterally withdrawing from Yemen. We saw also a decline in the bellicose rhetoric of both Saudi Arabia and UAE towards Iran. We also have seen visits, some announced, some unannounced, by UAE officials to Iran. And the Saudis are not as vocal as they were about Iran only maybe 6-7 months ago. I mean, so that policy is effective. Iran wants to strike at the weakest elements of the American empire, and these are the Gulf regimes. I mean, it takes only, and I know this from a, confidential source in Lebanon. This happened like only maybe 3-4 years ago. There was a visit that was unannounced by a UAE official who went to Lebanon, and they were sending a message to Hezbollah to the effect that if only they would distance themselves from Iran, things would be better for them, or something to that effect. I'm not sure if this was an American message or a UAE message. And my informant told me, very highly placed, is that the message was given back to them was to the effect that if you think you can take war to Iran, the high towers of Dubai will be hit. And I think that that's a message that is being now delivered. They want to say that it is so easy to disrupt an economy based on tourism and financial center inside Dubai. And the Iranians want to make that threat very clear. Now, their calculation here is that America will not go to war, and I think this is what you were alluding to, that America will not go to war for the sake of these polygamous princes in the Gulf. And certainly Trump is less likely, than Republican or Democratic presidents previous to go to war for the sake of these polygamous princes and kings. And thus far, it has proven to be accurate what they are doing. The only thing is, things could get out of control. And if shots are fired, if American troops are hit, if pressure mounts in Congress against Trump in order to go to war, things could change. But thus far, I think Iranian calculations have delivered a very strong message to America's allies that you will not be spared bloodshed if it was visited on Iran.
To quote that great philosopher Mike Tyson, the boxer, everybody has an argument till you get punched in the face. So
right.
This was a message that Iran was sending to Saudi Arabia. If you start a war, this is the kind of damage that could be done to you. Now,
or if the sanctions continue as they are, without our ability to sell oil, we will also visit it upon you.
Well, the reaction of the Trump administration was more sanctions. Now, Lindsey Graham and all the others up on Capitol Hill can scream their heads off and all their rhetoric, but there are people over here in the Pentagon, here in Northern Virginia where I am, that actually calculate things out. And they,
right.
if they're being honest, and there will be, at least show to their superiors, they could show the absolute devastation that would result. And they just got a taste of it. That's what you're saying. Iran just gave them a taste of it. They want to crush, even without Bolton there, they want to crush Iran, obviously, all these people you mentioned. But can they realistically do that without suffering too much? It will not be a useful victory for the United States. And they probably in the end would destroy Iran and its infrastructure and its government, but at an enormous cost. And we've seen a little bit of that. Aren't they recalculating now at the Pentagon, even inside the White House, about what this would mean? Shouldn't they be? Or, I mean, I can't imagine they aren't.
Well, I mean, I think what is ironic since Vietnam is that the military in America has become the least eager for war compared to the other establishment segment of the government, of the power elite, because the military knows that they will have to do the fighting and the dying, and they have seen the cost of that to them. I mean, the people, the civilians of Iraq and Afghanistan, nobody cares about that, not in the United States for sure. They don't even do counting, as they say now anymore, of these victims of the other side. So I cannot imagine a situation where these military generals will come to Trump with some scenarios of war in which he would say, let's go. I think they are capable of providing these accurate, deadly, and scary scenarios that will make him very reluctant. And of course, another time I cite Robert Gates, where he gave a speech at the end of his term as Secretary of Defense at West Point, and he famously said, any president who ever considered going to war in the Middle East again would have to have his head examined. The cost of that is going to be tremendous. Iran is not Iraq on many levels. One, it's a much larger country. Two, it has a much larger population. Three, it has so many much more resources and a much more military resources than Iraq. And fourthly, the leadership of Iran, is far more calculating, certainly much more intelligent than Saddam Hussein's foolish leadership and his inability to read the world scene and so on. Fifthly, unlike Iraq, which had no support in the region whatsoever, not only Iran has segment of support, it has its own allies that are armed to the teeth, and they are close to the border of Israel, the dear, cuddled, spoiled child of the American empire. And that makes the cost of any confrontation with Iran very high, not only militarily and politically. And I think if Iraq, which was totally exhausted, when the United States invaded Iraq, people forget, it was destroyed. America has already destroyed it in 1991, and with the bombing that never stopped throughout the 1990s, and with very stiff sanctions that even prevented the arrival of pencils to the children of Iraq because they were deemed dangerous because the lead inside them could be used for military purposes. That was the calculation of the Clinton administration. People forget that. And it is for this reason. So if Iraq, that was exhausted and fatigued and weakened, was able to drag the US into this protracted conflict from which it has not been able to extricate itself, and it doesn't seem to want to extricate itself, you can imagine what an Iran confrontation would look like. For that reason, I cannot see, even if there's pressure on Trump, and if he were to order bombing, so on, it is not going to be a major confrontation. He's not going to dispatch troops. And also, as General Mattis said before he was Secretary of Defense, when he was still in the armed forces, he said that the Israel question poses a danger to the safety of US troops because it creates such hostility to America's presence in the region, as if people do not mind America's presence without Israel, but it adds to it. And that means that the 5,000 troops in Iraq, at least 5,000, and at least 2,000 in Syria, and 14,000 in Afghanistan, they will be quite vulnerable because Iran has the capability, if it wants, to bomb American targets.
And the Pentagon knows that very well. What was the reaction of the Saudis? You read the regional press. It didn't seem to be as robust as you might expect. It was like a bully that was somebody stood up to. The way I see it, they didn't really respond with as much bellicosity as I would have thought.
You're absolutely right. They feel also rather embarrassed. They are embarrassed. And even in the New York Times today, you start to see the beginning of the criticism of Trump, which is very new in the Saudi and in the UAE press. But this is always the pattern of Saudi treatment of any US administration. Remember when Obama first arrived, he was hailed and praised in Saudi Arabia. By the end of his term, of course, they were starting to criticize him. And some people were suspecting that he was a secret Shiite who harbored love for the Iranian people out of his own doctrinal theology. I'm seeing for the first time this week criticism of the Trump administration. And basically, the Gulf despots are always disappointed. They always want America to give them more support. This is why they are building a relationship with Israel, assuming wrongly, of course, that the Israeli state is going to come to their rescue with Israeli soldiers in order to save them, which of course is not going to happen. Of course, the Israelis still support them as it has for many years and decades, but it's not going to go to war for their own sake. It has its own agenda. And Israel, of course, now is inside the domestic turmoil, which makes it very unlikely to be part of a major military advance anywhere in the region. The Saudis now, on the one hand, want to blame Iran for public relations purposes, propaganda purposes, but on the other hand, they are softening the rhetoric. They are not making the kind of statement that they used to make, because I think that they know if they continue to escalate the rhetoric, they have to take it to the logical conclusion, which is to strike at Iran. And if that occurs, I mean, they are declaring war on Iran officially, even though they have unofficially, and that will take this entire conflict to another level and would give Iran a reason to attack, and this time directly and openly, targets inside Saudi Arabia or maybe UAE. But I should also mention that there was an announcement that didn't get much attention 2 days ago in the independent Arabic section. I mean, people forget that the independent newspaper, which we progressives used to like and read so many times over the years, has become now in the custody of a business person who is tied to the Saudi government. And the Arabic section is now run by the propaganda apparatus of Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince. And the independent Saudi Arabia version announced 2 days ago that they were part of the coalition that bombed Iranian targets inside Syria. Now that's new. And the Iranians have not responded to that publicly from what I've seen. Could the Iranians take that as an opportunity for another strike, a direct strike or not? I don't know. But I also know that there are negotiations going on as we speak. I think the channels of communication between Iran and the United States are open. The fact that Iranian leaders are saying, we will not negotiate until these terms and so on, tells me that they are negotiating indirectly through the Japanese, through the French, and through the Omanis. So there is a situation of negotiations going on. And I think this was what the Trump administration wanted. I mean, Trump, as we know, is not a man of details. He doesn't know much about public policy or foreign policy. But he is very much driven by fame, by vanity, and by an attempt to leave an imprint on history. And the agreement, the nuclear agreement that had the thumb and the name of Obama, is what caused his consternation. He wants to leave history with peace agreement and negotiated settlements that carry the name of Trump, just like casinos do and hotels and apartment buildings. And that has not materialized yet. It hasn't in North Korea and hasn't in Iran. He may now find out through this indirect negotiations with the Iranians that perhaps an agreement with Iran is far more within closer reach than a possible agreement in North Korea. And for that reason, this could expedite the process of messages back and forth with the Iran and the United States in the next few weeks and months, and perhaps during the United Nations negotiations.
That brings me to the question I wanted to ask you about how the removal of John Bolton might figure into the calculations that Joe mentioned just a few minutes ago regarding, the US's view on the feasibility of war with Iran, as well as the attitude of Iran towards the United States and the Saudis and its allies.
The Russian government is also part of the negotiations that's going on, and they have very good relations with the Iranians, and they have good relations with the Israelis, so they are part of the picture as well. But I think the Iranians are now focusing all their energies on trying to expose the vulnerability and the fragility of the Gulf despot, to tell the world and to tell them that even if they may not strike at the US directly, even without the US firing any shot at Iran, that they will continue to escalate as long as they suffer from these stiff sanctions.
Now, another thing I wanted to ask you about was Caitlin Johnstone, a great independent journalist, recently took some shots at Mike Pompeo for using a line that was basically straight out of the satirical Onion outlet, basically saying that any attack on Saudi oil is an act of war against the United States. I wanted to get your take on that, the degree to which we've kind of, lost the ability to even satirize these types of moves by the United States.
Right, but we notice also, Pompeo, unlike Bolton, is much more malleable and much more susceptible to direct orders from Trump to change his mind and to change his rhetoric. I noticed on one day he said that, the next day he's emphasizing, even from the Gulf, that the answer is a peaceful settlement. And I think the announcement by the Trump administration today about the intensification of sanctions, and of course he wants to make it the most stiff sanctions ever produced, as if the sanctions against Iraq in the 1990s could have been in any way stiffer than they were. As I said, denying the children of Iraq medicine and school supply, how more stiff that it could have been. And I think that the announcement is basically, they are not resorting to the military option thus far. But accident could happen. Accident could happen. What if Iran attacks a target inside a Gulf country and they mistakenly hit US troops or something like that? So things could get out of hand.
Moving forward, how dangerous do you think this is? Could this, with the support of Russia that Iran has and the larger geopolitical situation, do you think that this type of conflict, if some sort of horrible accident did happen, could that have the potential of dragging us into what we might call World War III, or do you think that would be avoided somehow?
Far from sounding as supporter of the Trump administration, and I think many of us on the left now are accused of not being critical enough of Trump. But the reality is, it's not so much being defensive of Trump, but it's like Republican and Democrats are far worse. They are much more the war lobby. They have had decades to invest in a war project that has continued unabated in more than 70 places in the world since the Second World War. And it is for that reason I feel Trump personally would be more resistant to that than previous president. And that, I think, is a calming influence. The other thing you have to be said is that mistakes are possible, but the Iranians are also very calculating. And the Saudis and the UAE are not wild. They know how vulnerable they are. And they know their economies are very fragile. If you cut the supply of oil and if you affect tourism in Dubai, what's left? Their economies would collapse and they would not be the fabulously wealthy monarchy that they are. So I think that there are different reasons why different parties in this conflict are less willing to go wild.
As'ad, you mentioned that the Saudis thought that Obama may have been a Shiite lover. Of course, that was during the negotiation for the nuclear deal with Iran. And after. Sorry?
And after the deal.
And after the deal. However, during the deal is when the war against Yemen began. And I have theorized, and I want to know what you think, that Obama said, calculated, listen, let's divert their attention, give them something, and they'll get off our back and we can go through with the Iranian deal. You agree with this?
You're absolutely right. And in fact, I do not recall right now who in the Obama administration all but admitted that America's role as an enabler of the Saudi war on Yemen was a payback for the fact that they were upset and hurt by the agreement with Iran. No doubt about it, no doubt. They protected them at the UN, as I said. They gave them so much military and intelligence support and so on. So certainly that was the calculation. They thought that would appease them, but they didn't know that it was much more than that they were requiring. They wanted at that time an all-out war on Iran, and they didn't get it. And now they are frustrated. And now they realize there is not going to be war. But now they realize something else. They realize war or no war, things as they stand, Saudis will be paying the price. The UAE will be paying the price. So I think now Iran, by its movement and bombing, if they were behind it, have changed the calculus on the part of its enemies in the Gulf.
The question of whether Iran was behind is interesting because Obama's State Department spokesman at the time the war began actually made this statement. You can look it up. He said that Iran does not have operational influence in Yemen. So right. At that time, given that they're from different branches of Shiism as well, and the fact that Yemen was awash with weapons, as every UN diplomat was saying, they didn't need weapons from Iran at that point. Now, has that changed? I think you inferred that Iran has gotten more involved than they were at the beginning.
There's no question about that. I mean, if you look at WikiLeaks, American diplomatic cables from this century indicated that the Saudis have widely exaggerated the links between Iran and the Houthis. The links were really small. And also, even theologically, there is worlds apart between them. Here in the media, of course, they use shorthand. Shiites this and Shiite that. In reality, they are as far apart as mainstream Sunnis and mainstream Shiites are. After the war, however, the Houthis felt, from their standpoint, they have no choice but to deepen ties with the Iranians. And the Iranians, on the other hand, as the conflict in the region escalated, felt that we can resort to support the Houthis as a way to get back at Saudi Arabia. So there's no doubt that things have definitely increased. And we see that the firepower of the Houthis have increased. But we should remember that much of the weapons that the Houthis have used, even against Saudi Arabia, were supplied to Yemen by the American government in previous administration, Democrat and Republican. That's largely unsaid. The Yemeni dictator of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, was owned by the Americans, not by the Soviet government. I should also say that, in case there is a military escalation, Iran, the Houthis will feel that they were part of it, because the Houthis will get more hit by the Saudis, and the Iranians will feel the Saudis deserve to be hit by them or by the Houthis, who are strategically located south of Saudi Arabia.
You mentioned the Russians before, and this is quite interesting because there was a resolution. Nobody mentions it anymore. It was not a binding one. In other words, it wasn't a Chapter 7 resolution, which binding to usually use when force is authorized. They use Chapter 7. It was a Chapter 6 resolution, but it did say that Hadi was the president of Yemen, and it kind of in a way, it did not discourage. Let's put it. I don't remember the exact language now, but let's put it this way: the Saudis have interpreted it as an authorization for them to go in to Yemen. Russia abstained on that resolution. I actually asked number 2. I think he was in the Russian mission at an American reception. So all you do with the UN is go to receptions. And I asked him, why did you abstain on that? Why didn't you veto that resolution? And he literally dropped the drink that he had in his hand to the ground and walked away. Now, I don't know whether that was intentional or not, but why didn't Russia try to stop that? If you recall the resolution I'm talking about, As'ad, why didn't they do more to stop the Saudis from going in there?
Well, I think it's fair to say, and you know the UN much more than I do, or most people do, I would say that the watershed of the Russian attitude to a resolution of the UN was 2011 and the UN Security Council Resolution 1973 authorized the use of force for protection of civilians in Libya, which the American government took as a license to basically invade and attack and cause so much mayhem and destruction in Libya. I mean, Libya is still suffering from that wrong-headed Obama administration exploitation, illegal exploitation of a United Nations resolution. Since then, the Chinese and the Russians have realized that the Americans are capable of exploiting any resolution under Chapter 7 to their own ends. And they don't allow that. Whether it's through abstention, whether it's through vetoing, they are going to hold firm on that, I think, especially in the Middle East region, because they know of the American insatiable appetite for war and conflict and domination in that region. I mean, I think that the Russian government, I mean, is selecting its conflict with the Americans, but it has increased though. I mean, Russian opposition to UN design, to US design in the Security Council, and Chinese opposition has been increasing as well since 2011. And that has really reduced the ability of the US to use the UN, since it has done since the end of the Cold War, to its very end, to its own end. And this is something that was clearly mentioned in the book by Brent Scowcroft and George Herbert Walker Bush, which said that on one page that we basically will use the UN as a cover for our own designs. And they have done that. Now it's more difficult.
That's been the MO of the United States vis-a-vis the UN almost from the beginning.
Right.
Certainly in recent
more
years.
so since the end of the Cold War. Yeah.
Yeah, after 9/11, after the invasion of Iraq, for example, they didn't get the resolution, and they did whatever they wanted anyway. But if they could get one, you know, it's useful. I'm reminded of a story that you know very well, I'm sure, 1934. This is a story that Mohammed bin Salman should know.
Right.
That in 1934, King Abdulaziz Al Saud, the first king of Saudi Arabia, of that, the third version of Saudi Arabia or whatever, told John Philby, the British agent, quote, "My fathers and grandfathers didn't own Yemen, and no one has been able to achieve security and stability there. Who can rule Yemen with its Saidis and its problems?"
Right, right.
That's something maybe that they should have heeded before they went in there.
Joe, the Saudi hegemony over Yemen is such that the royal family, would appoint one of the princes to be in charge of Yemen. Like, Yemen would have its own sovereign government, and they would appoint a prince. For long years, it was Prince Sultan, the Minister of Defense. He was basically the viceroy of Yemen. Even when Yemen had communist government, you know what that meant? They meant either you dominate the northern government at the time, and then things are well, and if you cannot control the government of the south, then you undermine it. I mean, the reason why the only Marxist Arab Republic fell is by virtue of American, Saudi designs and covert wars and operations against them during the Cold War, in the war against communism.
Well, so back to Russia for a second. That the Libyan resolution was when Medvedev was president, and the story goes that Putin, prime minister with less power, was furious about this. Wouldn't let it happen again. But this Yemen vote came with Putin in charge. So I don't know if there's some kind of deal there, if he was distracted, or if he didn't see with Chapter 7, he didn't have to bother. I don't know, but I don't know if that would have helped.
I mean, do you think Medvedev would dare to make a decision about a UN resolution like that without consulting with his prime minister, Putin, at the time?
I don't know. But maybe Putin screwed up and he's blaming him. I don't know. But that's the way the story goes now.
I mean, Putin must. I mean, I think they must not. I mean, you learn in foreign policy, right? I mean, they must have assumed that the U.S. under no circumstances would be able to exploit a resolution that only speaks about the protection of civilians as a license for invasion, right? Who would have thought that? But if you know American history well, you would think that this is a no-brainer, right? They're going to exploit it.
Of course. Now, one would think, if one had sane mind and a diplomatic bent, of thinking that this should be the call to get a solution to the war in Yemen, that this cannot escalate, and now the real diplomatic effort has to be made to solve this Yemeni crisis as a first step towards some kind of lessening of tensions and some kind of normalization between the Saudi camp and the Iranians. But that ain't going to happen, is it, As'ad?
No, on the contrary, Joe. I feel now, ironically, as close as we are to the brink, this could be the occasion for all the sides to basically try to achieve a peaceful settlement. I mean, if you look at all the sides of the conflict, I mean, the Americans, under Trump, I should say, Trump does not want a military confrontation. So there's one side. Saudis and the UAE now have been hit directly and are far less warmongering than they've ever been. And they may be more interested than ever today. I mean, that's the irony of arriving at a settlement with their enemy, Iran. You have also on the side of the Iranian government, Iran is clearly suffering from the sanctions and they would like relief. And they know only an agreement with the Trump administration would achieve that. And I think that what we may basically receive is a agreement similar with longer terms for how long it will take for the Iranian to break the threshold of creating a bomb, with tighter limitations and so on, as well as, I mean, there were two other factors that were mentioned by the Trump administration, right? They wanted to add the ballistic missile, and they wanted to add the Iranian role in the region, support for its lines and so on. That's not going to change. There is no way on earth that's going to change, because that is, in the absence of nuclear bomb, that is one of the assurances that Iran has, especially on the border with Israel, for its own survival. But I think they may have accept limits on ballistic missile production or things like that, or testing. And I think this could be possible. I do not rule it out. We could be close to that. And that's why I am much less alarmed about possibility of war after the hit on the Saudi oil fields. Because also America knows, and Trump is, if anything, he is obsessed with the economic situation and numbers, especially in election year, but even if there's no election year. And any disruption in the oil production is going to mean tremendous rise in oil prices. I mean, people talk about strategic reserves. I mean, strategic reserves are really limited. I mean, given our consumption of oil here in this country or in the world, I mean, strategic reserves, Saudi Arabia and America would last only a few months. I mean, it's not like we have them to last for several years, which is enough in order to, balance the market again. But it's not like that.
Well, I also think there's a less likely chance of war after this hit, as I said at the beginning, but I didn't go as far as what you're suggesting. There could be a conference, a Berlin conference, a conference in Paris somewhere, out of the region, bringing all the leaders together and working out these things. That would be obviously where you have to go. And one sign that may be on the cards is if Trump indeed meets Rouhani in New York next week at the General Assembly. There was talk of that happening. Macron wanted to do it. Both sides said it ain't going to happen anymore, but who knows?
Well, I mean, I think we saw evidence of that also in Beatrice in the G7 summit, right? The fact that the Iranian foreign minister flew there, he met with Macron, but he did not meet with Trump. That in itself indicated that Iranian rhetoric sometimes is much higher than what's going on behind the scenes. We've seen that before they agreed to negotiate with the Obama administration as well. So sometimes the Iranians are as duplicitous as governments in the region. They may be raising slogans that are very anti-American while their messengers, diplomats, are negotiating secretively with American diplomats.
Right. The G7 or G7 took place, of course, before the attack on the oil installations. But if we see Rouhani and Trump meeting next week, maybe we have some hope that everyone realizes here they don't want this war. Nobody's really going to win in the end.
Right. I mean, the meeting with Rouhani, I think, is unlikely. It's too soon.
Yeah.
There has to be pre-summit negotiations from which the Iranians are going to get some guarantees of some sort. I mean, look, Iran is far more seasoned and calculating and experienced in international diplomacy and reading American foreign policy than the North Korean leader, right? And even Kim Jong-un did not trust the Americans. He is not going to disarm in return for promises. He wanted some ironclad assurances and lifting of sanctions. When he didn't get that, he walked away. And I mean, this is an inexperienced leader. So imagine the Iranians. It's going to take some material, physical rewards.
If the Trump administration doesn't attack Iran right now in retaliation for the starting a war in Yemen, could the Democrats, we're in an election season now, use that against him and say, look, he's weak on Iran?
No doubt. And I think that, some Republicans would even participate in this charade. There is clearly thirst for a response by the Americans. And the thing is, don't you like the word response? I mean, when they use the word response, it's like as if America has been attacked, like another Pearl Harbor. I mean, this is Saudi Arabia. This is a Saudi oil installation. And the United States is not tied of mutual defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. And I think, if anything, it has also exposed to Saudi Arabia that despite their exorbitant expenditure on military warfare and equipment, it hasn't protected them. The Saudi people are now aware it has all been merely an investment in American approval and support for Saudi royal family. And these expenditures are not going to protect them. America is not going to protect them. This is why the Saudis have no choice but to negotiate with the Iranians, and even to pressure the Americans to negotiate with the Iranians.
Well, so today the United States announced they're sending troops and air defense systems to Saudi Arabia. Can they array Patriot missiles to protect the oil fields?
Well, we've seen the Patriot missiles, just as the Iron Dome of Israel, are really impressive on paper, but in actuality, they hit far less than what they are advertised to be. And I like how they always take them back to the drawing board after every war, say that we have now a new version that is far more improved than the previous version. And then there is war, and we find that they make fantastic claim in the beginning of, we shot 90% of all missiles, and then we only learn after some scientists at MIT conduct a new study that 5% or 7% actually were intercepted.
No refund to the taxpayer for that, by the way.
Yeah, right.
As'ad AbuKhalil is a professor of politics in California, at Modesto, California. And I really appreciate you coming on to talk Iran. And I hope that you are correct, that we are not going to get involved in a catastrophic conflict over this situation. So we really enjoyed our conversation with you and with Arne Menconi before that, and earlier with Peter B. Collins, as we talked about this Ukrainian scandal and the Assange update. So Elizabeth, I just want to say goodnight to you and to our audience. We're actually finishing on time tonight, a 2-hour show from 8 to 10. And we invite you to come next Friday again, same time, 8 p.m. Eastern time, for CN Live, episode 11. Good night, everyone.
Get out your notebook. There's more.